A tangible act of support for small modular reactors among a dozen countries, including South Korea, at this year's NPT review conference in New York. Now, Lee Seung-jae has more on this latest multinational vote of confidence for nuclear energy.
During the 2022 NPT review conference in New York on Thursday, countries including South Korea, the U.S., Japan, and 9 others agreed on facilitating the safe and secure utilization of civilian nuclear reactors in what's been dubbed the FIRST program. FIRST, which stands for Foundational Infrastructure for the Responsible Use of Small Modular Reactor Technology, provides the foundation for partner countries to take advantage of advanced nuclear technologies and upcoming innovations in reactor design to meet energy security and climate goals. It also calls for the highest international standards and guidelines for safety, security, and non-proliferation. The joint statement issued by the 12 countries also welcomed safe and secure growth for nuclear power, noting that nuclear energy not only provides a clean energy supply, but also supports local job growth, energy security, air pollution, and carbon reduction goals, and global clean technology innovation. However, it stressed the peaceful use of nuclear energy to help meet U.S. Sustainable Development Goals in line with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, President Yoon Suk-yeol has stressed the importance of his administration and the ruling party working in lockstep to promote people's livelihoods. Such thoughts were shared during a speech at a People Power Party workshop in Cheonan, a city some 90 kilometers south of Seoul.
좋지 않은 이런 성적표와 또 국제적인 여러 경제 위기를 이런 상황에서 우리 정권이 출범했지만 이제 더 이상은 국제 상황에 대한 핑계나 또 전 정권에서 잘못한 것을 우리가 물려받았다는 핑계도 더 이상은 이제 국민에게 통하지 않는다고 생각합니다.
He emphasized that the ruling bloc and the government need to work as a team and solely focus on easing the plight facing people here to regain public trust. Now, this workshop was the first of its kind since Yoon took office back in May. It was attended by members of the top office, the cabinet, and 101 members out of the 115-member PPP. The Yoon administration is offering a broad support framework for the country's small businesses, especially those hard hit by the prolonged pandemic. A big part of that plan involves sharpening their competitive edge by promoting their digital presence. Our Choi Min-jung has details.
Turning small neighborhood businesses into innovative entrepreneurs. This is what the South Korean government is striving to achieve. During the 6th emergency meeting on economic affairs, the Ministry of SMEs and Startups on Thursday revealed new measures to support small business owners and the self-employed. The ministry's immediate plan is to help businesses recover to pre-pandemic levels. This is mainly done by supporting businesses that have shut down and helping owners get back on their feet. The government says it will subsidize costs for shutting down businesses and provide psychological treatment and legal advice for those in need. Around $22 billion will be used to help owners of failed businesses start a new business. And more than $43 billion will be injected to ease the burden of high-interest loans. These owners will also be able to consult with experts and receive training. The ministry also plans on increasing the number of national shopping events like the Korea Sale Festa to boost consumption. The long-term plan is to foster entrepreneurship and market competitiveness for small business owners. In order to do that, the government says it will improve the digital infrastructure to ensure owners keep up with the fast-changing society. Small businesses and traditional markets will also be able to make use of smart technologies and online platforms to boost sales. The Minister of SMEs and Startups, Arirang, paid a visit to a traditional market to take part in selling a product through live commerce. In addition, small businesses will now be able to receive the same benefits even if their business grows in size. Businesses were previously no longer considered small if their sales or the number of employees reached a certain level. But now, the number of workers will no longer be a factor in determining the size of a business. And lastly, the ministry has vowed to ramp up measures to boost small neighborhoods by promoting cooperation between small business owners and local citizens. The minister said the government aims to change the public's perception that people start small businesses just to make a living. He promised to bring visible improvements within 3 years and transform small business owners into innovative entrepreneurs who bring joy to life. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
In other news, South Korea will take measures to stabilize the foreign exchange market if needed. Now, this is according to Vice Finance Minister Bang Ki-sun on this Friday. The remarks were made in response to concerns that speculative bets by investors may further fuel market volatility. As for the Korean won plunging to a 13-year low against the US dollar, the minister claimed the reality had little to do with the country's external soundness and more with the strong dollar. He did nonetheless add that close monitoring of the bond market and the Fed's annual Jackson Hole meeting set for Friday local time will continue. In the US, the country's economy shrank yet again in the second quarter this year, but pundits remain divided over calling the reality a recession. Our Shin Se-byuk explains.
The U.S. economy has shrunk for the second quarter in a row this year due to high inflation and rising interest rates. Data from the U.S. Commerce Department on Thursday shows that gross domestic product, deemed the broadest measure of economic output, contracted at an annual pace of 0.6% last quarter. However, the contraction is an upward revision from the previous estimate of a 0.9% decline. Much of the revision came thanks to better data on consumer spending. The 2 straight quarterly decreases in GDP meet the standard definition of a technical recession. Recessions are defined by 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth and are characterized by high unemployment, low or negative GDP growth, falling income, and slowing retail sales. In the case of the U.S., however, experts say broader measures of economic activity such as solid readings from the labor market, retail sales, and industrial production suggest a slow pace of expansion rather than a downturn. Meanwhile, gross domestic income, or GDI, an alternative measure of growth, expanded by 1.4% in the second quarter, suggesting that the economy is supported by a robust labor market and resilient consumer spending. Amid mixed signals on the U.S. economy, all eyes are on Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's speech at the annual Economic Policy Conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming on Friday for the central bank's view on inflation and interest rate policy going forward. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, efforts continue to diffuse tensions surrounding a nuclear power plant there, currently under Russian control. Now, Kyiv says Russian forces are using the plant as a shield, raising the risk of nuclear disaster, while Moscow claims Ukrainian forces are shelling the plant. Our Kim Hyo-sun has the latest.
U.S. President Joe Biden held a phone conversation with his Ukrainian counterpart on Thursday, during which they called for Russia to hand over control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Ukrainian authorities. During the conversation held to mark Ukraine's Independence Day, the 2 leaders also called for international officials to assess the safety of the plant.
Good afternoon. And so we have said Russia should agree to demilitarize the zone around the plant and agree to allow an international atomic energy agency visit as soon as possible to check on the safety and security of the systems.
Amid fears of a nuclear disaster, the chief of the International Atomic Energy Agency stated that an agreement on access to the facility has almost been reached with all related parties. While visiting France on Thursday, he further explained that Ukraine and Russia have both agreed on the need for a group of experts to visit the plant. Against this backdrop, the last 2 working reactors at the nuclear plant were briefly cut off from Ukraine's power grid on Thursday. That's according to Ukrainian authorities, who said the cause was nearby fires that damaged overhead electricity lines. The latest news comes amid growing concern over fighting near the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is the largest nuclear plant in Europe. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Right, and that ends the first half of the Daily Report. In the second half, we touch upon an upcoming international fleet review to be hosted by Japan. Stay with us.
Custer's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean new Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis, pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
Protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
So good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back. Japan is scheduled to host an international naval fleet review in November, and the country has extended an invitation to South Korea for the first time in 7 years. For more on the broader implications of this upcoming event, I have Professor Lee Hee-on at Handong Global University joining our session virtually, that is. Professor Lee, welcome back.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Willie Ju at Waseda University, who is currently over in the US, joining us live on the line as well. Professor Ju, it's a pleasure.
Nice meeting you.
Right, Professor Lee, we'll start with you then. Let's start with a few words on this upcoming International Fleet Review to be hosted by Japan in the month of November.
Right. So an international fleet review basically is the maritime equivalent of a military parade. And so, as you know, when you look at military parades, the country shows off its hardware as well as, its military power sort of on land. So a fleet review really is the equivalent sort of on the water. And so, the Maritime Self-Defense Force for Japan has been holding a fleet review since basically 1956. And now the last time it tried to hold one, it was in 2019, but that was canceled because of a typhoon. But noticeably at that time, Korea was not invited because of the tensions between both Japan and Korea. But in any event, the idea of a fleet review, it really is to project the naval power to the country, but also to the region. And so if you think about now this situation in Northeast Asia, the fleet review has significance because, of course, you have tensions with Russia and also, of course, namely Japan and China. So China I'm sure, will be very interested in seeing what Japan does within this context of this fleet review.
Right. And Professor Ju, I believe this year marks the 70th anniversary of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Forces founding, and accordingly, authorities are planning to host a very large-scale international fleet review for the first time in 2 decades. What more can you tell us about this upcoming event and about the countries that are poised to partake in it?
So as Professor Lee mentioned earlier, the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, or WPNS, is a forum for nations in the region to foster mutual understanding, cooperation among their navies. This started back in 1988, and currently it consists of around 20 members, including countries in East and Southeast Asia, in North and South America, as well as several Pacific Island states. Now, symposia and workshops are held regularly, and as you already mentioned, Japan is host to this year's symposium. For this year's event, invitations to attend the fleet review have been sent out collectively to all WPNS members except Russia. And I want to point out that this is in contrast to the fleet review in Japan scheduled in 2019, which Professor Lee alluded to earlier, when invitations were sent out on a country-by-country basis. And back then, of course, South Korea was not invited due to disputes over this radar incident.
Right, and staying with that then, Professor Lee, what more can you tell us a bit about that is, the implications of this particular event where South Korea has now been invited, and perhaps the subsequent participation of South Korea to this event by Japan in November?
Right. So as Professor Ju already mentioned, because of the tensions between South Korea and Japan, Korea was not specifically invited to the 2019 fleet review by Japan. And so this current invitation now being extended to South Korea is clearly a confidence-building measure that's being extended by the Kishida administration to the Yoon administration. And so basically, we're about 4 months into the Yoon administration. And so President Yoon has obviously called for better relations between Japan and South Korea. And so because of this, I think, building a relationship between these two administrations, each side wants to see sort of commensurate measures being taken by each side to build up confidence, and then get to a point where there can be maybe mutual trust with respect to issues related to the economy, but namely security. And so basically, this invitation is the effort to cultivate a better working relationship. And so here, I think what we're seeing is with the foreign minister, South Korean foreign minister visiting Japan, and then now the Japanese inviting South Korea to this fleet review, I think we're going to see on both sides commensurate actions to so then build up to potentially, who knows, a summit between the two leaders at some point in the future.
Right. And against that backdrop, Professor Ju, here in South Korea, some have raised concerns about the possible negative public sentiment, that is, related to the imperial era rising sun flag, which serves as the Japanese Navy's emblem. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, in fact, this was precisely the issue that led Japan to not take part in a fleet review that was held in South Korea back in 2018. Now, from the viewpoint of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and the Japanese government, the rising sun flag is simply seen as a naval emblem with a long tradition, without necessarily any symbolic association with imperialism or with colonial rule. And furthermore, Japan has argued that no objections were raised when the rising sun flag was used, when the Maritime Self-Defense Forces made visits or joint multilateral exercises elsewhere. So if the flag is acceptable to other countries, including Japan's enemies during the Second World War, such as the United States, then why should it not be acceptable to South Korea? So in short, I think for some South Koreans, the rising sun flag is connected to the terrible events that happened during the war, but the same connection often doesn't exist in the minds of a lot of Japanese.
Professor Lee, the South Korean Navy has also been invited to partake in a humanitarian search and rescue exercise following the fleet review. Again, what are your thoughts on these potential collaborations between Seoul and Tokyo on the naval front?
Right, so I think this is a clear signal to Korea and the rest of the region that both countries are taking steps to build this mutual trust I was referring to earlier. So the idea is this, that both countries, because they were sort of at rock bottom in their relationship in the previous administration, these are confidence and security building measures, basically to sort of root out any potential uncertainty in terms of cooperation moving forward. And so, humanitarian and search and rescue, of course, are not huge security issues. These are kinds of low-level issues that, I think countries can participate in. But this is a clear signal that because Japan's inviting South Korea to participate, it's a sort of a sign of goodwill on the part of the Japanese to say, hey, we're going to try to improve our relationship on our side. Please take steps on your side to also do the same. And so, this has to be seen, of course, in light of sort of the Yoon administration's efforts to sort of revitalize sort of the network between Japan, Korea, of course, and the United States as potentially a bloc of countries that may potentially counter China and particularly North Korea. And so this is, I think, clearly a step in that direction. And so this is low-lying fruit that both countries can grab after, and that I think will then move towards sort of greater cooperation potentially, maybe in terms of reestablishing, let's say, GSOMIA, the Intel Sharing Pact, other kinds of security measures that they can work with each other. But this is sort of the initial stages of then building this confidence and trust in each other. And then I think we'll see moving forward what will happen in terms of this relationship.
Right, and staying with what Professor Lee has mentioned, Professor Ju, President Yoon Suk-yeol has been very vocal about his intentions to improve ties with neighboring Japan. During his Liberation Day speech, this intention was also shared. And that being said, what has been the response to his remarks there in Japan?
I think the response has been one of cautious optimism. I think the Japanese government believes that the prospects for better bilateral relations have improved under the new South Korean administration, and President Yoon's speech, the Liberation Day speech, has likely reaffirmed that belief. At the same time, most of the issues that have caused bilateral tensions in recent years, from wartime forced labor and sexual slavery to the radar incident that I mentioned earlier, these problems still remain unresolved. So Japan still has some reservations. A few days ago, I'd like to mention that a former defense vice minister in Japan stated that Tokyo shouldn't assume that relations between Seoul and Tokyo have become bright and rosy just due to a change of government in South Korea. And this typifies the thinking among one major section of the ruling party, which the government cannot ignore. So while there's a positive response to President Yoon's speech in Tokyo, perhaps it would not be realistic to expect Japan to make major shifts from its long-held stance that all problems between the two countries have already been addressed by the 1965 treaty.
Right, I see. Professor Lee, staying with President Yoon Suk-yeol's speech during Liberation Day, he also claimed that Japan today is a partner as Korea and Japan face common threats that challenge the freedom of global citizens. Do you believe the shift in global order, which you also touched upon earlier, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Pyongyang's persistent provocations, do you say this reality will perhaps inevitably serve to push Tokyo and Seoul closer on the security front?
I think potentially, but I think the Yoon administration is clearly interested in promoting sort of a rules-based international order. And that, of course, is consistent with the United States as well, I think, as Japan as well. And so, one of the things that, of course, observers have seen, despite the historical tensions between the two countries, which are still not resolved, and they still will remain for quite some time, I think the idea is whether or not the two countries can put aside some of these differences in terms of dealing with present-day security interests, namely that North Korea, of course, and denuclearization, as well as China. And I think both countries clearly have an interest in that regard, a shared interest in dealing with these issues. Now, with Russia invading Ukraine, obviously, Korea and Japan have taken steps in order to support the effort in Ukraine against Russian aggression. But I think here the question is, and I think this is for the Japanese side more particularly, is Japan, of course, has a direct relationship in terms of dealing with the Northern Territories issue with Russia. Korea doesn't have a direct border with Russia. And so I think from the Japanese side, there's clearly much more of an interest in dealing with the Russian situation. But in any event, the idea here is, from a broad stroke perspective, the Yoon administration, I think, clearly is committed to this idea of a rules-based international order. I believe Japan as well and the United States. So this may lead these countries into this sort of block, potentially, again, to counter North Korea and China and potentially Russia in the region.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Ji, there are some who claim that Japan's perhaps cancellation of invitation to Russia to join the International Fleet Review and, of course, the related gathering on the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, such action raises the risk of perhaps prolonged confrontation between Western countries, including Japan, as well as countries like Russia and China. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay. So, Japan has long aligned itself with the U.S. in terms of its security and defense policy. So it's not surprising that Japan quickly joined other G7 members in imposing economic sanctions on Russia after the war in Ukraine broke out. And I should also add that these sanctions are backed by Japanese public opinion for the most part. And also, when the Japanese government repeatedly emphasized that any attempts to change the international order by force must be resisted, it probably had in mind not just the case of Ukraine, but also any potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. The idea is that if Japan is showing solidarity with the international community against Russia now, if something were to happen in the in Japan's own neighborhood, then it expects other countries around the world to show similar solidarity. Now, this of course is not explicitly stated, but I think the intention behind Japan's stance is pretty clear. At the same time, I also want to mention that Japan has not completely cut all ties with Russia. So, for example, the Japanese government decided to continue with an ongoing oil and liquefied gas project in Russia called Sakhalin-2. In any case, I think it's difficult to see Japan taking a softer or more conciliatory position toward Russia, even at the cost of prolonging geopolitical tensions with Russia and China, unless other G7 nations do the same. I don't see Japan acting, taking a unilateral stance on this issue.
Right. Professor Lee, back on bilateral ties between Seoul and Tokyo. Now, recently, South Korea's top court, that is, postponed a decision on wartime labor asset liquidation. And given that event, government officials here and over in Japan are actually seeking an alternative solution to this ongoing problem. What are your thoughts on such efforts?
Well, I think the court's delay in issuing a ruling on whether or not they will confirm the liquidation of the assets of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, I think, again, buys time for the Yoon administration in order to work out some sort of diplomatic resolution to this matter. Now, the complication here, of course, is Korea is a fully functioning democracy with checks and balances, and that checks and balances is with respect to the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And so the idea here is that I think the judicial branch is slightly giving some deference to the executive branch because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had submitted a request to the Supreme Court, I assume, to delay the ruling until they could work out a deal with Japan. But this is fraught with very big, I think, domestic political implications and, of course, obviously foreign relations implications with respect to the decision. And so it's not clear at this point whether or not the Yoon administration will be able to work out a deal that will satisfy enough every side. Obviously, the victims themselves who are demanding compensation and damages, as well as from the Japanese side that doesn't want to see any Japanese companies' assets liquidated. And so the Yoon administration is really in a tight place because it has to maneuver between domestic sentiment and the victims themselves, as well as its stated interest in improving relations with Japan. And so this particular decision is going to have a lot of long-standing, short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications for Japan-Korea relations. And so I think the best thing that we can do, of course, is wait and see what the Yoon administration will do, but also what the court will do moving forward.
Right. Professor Ju, 3 years ago on this month, Japan removed South Korea from its trade whitelist. What are the prospects of a reversal in that particular decision in the near future?
Okay, as you said, there's 3 chemical materials exported by South Korea were removed from the whitelist, which is basically about preferential trading partners back in 2019. It was reported in the Japanese media a few days ago that the South Korean foreign minister, when meeting with his Japanese counterpart at the beginning of this month, asked about restoring these items to the whitelist, but the Japanese side did not agree. I should add that this report has been denied by the Korean Foreign Ministry. Now, I think the Japanese government is tying this question to the wartime forced labor issue, as Professor Lee just touched on. And the Japanese government is firmly backing the 2 Japanese firms which have been accused and whose assets have been seized. And I believe that Japan may not be willing to take any initiatives on the whitelist question unless South Korea makes some further concessions on this forced labor compensation issue. However, as Professor Lee pointed out, South Korea is a democracy, and the relationships between between the judicial and the executive branches, that's probably the kind of nuance that Japan has not paid sufficient attention to up to now.
So it's something we'll have to watch and see what happens, as Professor Lee mentioned earlier. All right, Professor Ju, over in California, thank you so much for your time today. And Professor Lee, over in Pohang, thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.
South Korea's Air Force is making its official debut at a multinational air combat drill in Australia that begins next Monday. Now, ahead of this event, fighter jets from the 2 countries engage in aerial training there this week to enhance joint operational capabilities. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Peunji tells us what this means.
A South Korean warplane receives a mid-air refuel from an Australian tanker aircraft. South Korea's KF-16s and Australia's F-35As also fly side by side. A total of 8 aircraft took part in Thursday's flight in Australia, including 4 KF-16 fighters and 1 KC-330 tanker from South Korea, along with 1 KC-30A multi-role tanker transport and 2 F-35As from Australia.
Through today's flight and by conducting training that involved refueling from the Australian tanker, we were able to confirm the outstanding interoperability of the 2 countries' air forces.
The aim was to enhance operational capability ahead of a multinational maneuver called Exercise Pitch Black. This is the first time that South Korea has decided to take part in the biennial exercise led by Australia. Last week, South Korea sent a group of 6 KF-16 fighter jets and 1 KC-330 multi-role tanker transport, along with around 130 military personnel. During the exercise, the KF-16s will be refueled by the tanker, making it the first time for South Korea to refuel one of its own aircraft in midair in an overseas exercise. Australian Air Force commander who's leading the exercise welcomed South Korea's participation, saying the two countries have been great partners for decades. He also said Exercise Pitch Black will take them to the next level of tactical execution.
The friendship flight is symbolic, and really it's the kind of activity or interoperability that we'll actually be doing every day on this activity between Australia, the ROCAF and the other 15 nations that are here. And that'll just signal the depths of technical compatibility we're trying to achieve.
This year, Exercise Pitch Black will be joined by 17 countries, including the U.S., the UK, and Japan. The South Korean Air Force will take part from next Monday through September 7th. 배은지, Arirang News.
The 2022 Seoul Popcorn exhibition is now on in the South Korean capital city. Short for Seoul Pop Culture Convention, the event at the COEX Convention Center was formerly known as Seoul Comic-Con, but has since been renamed to embrace the wider pop culture scene beyond comics. The event features three main themes: content, including games, animation, films, music and comics, platforms such as online streaming services and social media, and technology, covering the latest advancements like artificial intelligence, NFTs and the metaverse. The event runs through Sunday. Also here in Seoul, an annual forum on culture brought together scholars in related fields to address the importance of space in communicating a country's cultural identity. Our Kim Jong-sil has more.
The theme for this year's Culture Communication Forum is how space has so much influence on the way we communicate and how it can represent culture. French-American scholar Guy Storming joined from New York via Zoom and opened the session with a speech on spaces that best represent Korean culture. One of the places he mentioned was Seoul City Hall, standing behind the old Metropolitan building that was built during the Japanese colonial period.
Imperialism, colonialism is also part of the South Korean history. And of course, you see the city hall wrapping the Japanese are overwhelmed in a way by the Seoul city hall. So all this is extremely beautiful, extremely significant.
David Pierre Zalicon, a French architect that built many buildings in South Korea, and Simon Lee of language data platform Fleeto both highlighted the beauty of Chongmyo Shrine as a representation of Korean culture. Another speaker, Professor Yoo Hyun-jun from Hongik University, also an architect, said he recommends the Han River parks to his colleagues from abroad.
I tell my foreign colleagues to go there at around 10 p.m. and buy beer at a convenience store, order food to be delivered and eat there, because there aren't many waterside parks in the world where you can go late at night and drink cheap alcohol.
Another subject that was discussed was how the pandemic has changed the way we communicate.
And as you know, because of COVID-19, space becomes very important factor, and space influences a lot for our cultural communication.
A new method of communication that drew a lot of attention during the pandemic includes metaverse and virtual reality. Speakers warn that the trend might be putting more people into isolation.
First of all, two things are lacking in virtual reality. First, there's no nature. Second, there's a lot of information but no means to meet people in real time. So if we build spaces where there's nature and people that is free of charge, people will naturally go outside.
The forum highlighted how space allows people to engage with others in person and how important that is for human beings.
Space allows for the discovery of diversity of class, of race, of gender, of nation. Space is also a factor for peace in this troubled world.
Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
South Korea's major gateway to and from the world, Incheon International Airport, is currently hosting what some pundits are calling a preview of major art fairs to be held here in Seoul next month. Our culture correspondent Kim Hyun-sung was there.
Incheon International Airport is where most visitors get their first glimpse of Korea when arriving in the country and their last look at the country when leaving. Now, to give a good lasting impression, For the next month or so, Incheon International Airport is going to be displaying a range of artworks, but not just any art, cutting-edge and futuristic art. Around 60 pieces of art are displayed along the first floor of Terminal 1. They're mostly NFT artworks, pieces that combine art with new media. The airport has partnered up with the Galleries Association of Korea to bring the Korean International Art Fair to this unconventional venue.
We put together this exhibition to show you that Incheon International Airport is not just a place to get on and off a plane, but a cultural and artistic hub that not just represents Korea, but also the world.
Some of the most famous NFT works are here, like art by Korean illustrator Mr. Misang. But Incheon Airport is only the beginning, a sneak peek of what's coming in September. 3 major art fairs will take place then, on a scale unheard of in Asia. Kiev Seoul, Kiev Plus, and Frieze Art Fair are all opening up in Seoul City. Some 350 galleries from all over the world are coming together. And for Frieze, a distinguished art magazine based in London, it's the first time that it's bringing its art fair to Asia.
We're garnering a lot of international attention, and with this art fair, we hope that Seoul can secure its place as Asia's art hub.
For art fans who want to see more new media art from emerging artists like the ones displayed in Incheon Airport, and works from some of the biggest names in the contemporary art scene, Seoul is the place to be this September. Kim Hyun-seung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Afghanistan, flooding this month has led to death and destruction. Speaking at a news conference on Thursday, a Taliban spokesman said that floods had killed 182 people and injured a further 250. This follows heavy rain in Afghanistan's central and eastern provinces over the past month. The floods have also damaged some 3,100 houses and killed thousands of farm animals. This has only worsened the already dire humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Aid organizations on the ground are struggling to provide assistance as the country has been cut off from most international funding since the Taliban takeover in August last year. The floods come on the back of other natural disasters throughout 2022, the most recent being an earthquake in June that killed over 1,000 people. To Japan now, where the country's national police agency chief has announced his resignation. Itaru Nakamura said Thursday he takes full responsibility for the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and that the organization needs a fresh start. It comes as an investigation found security flaws that led to the 67-year-old politician's death on July 8th at a campaign rally in Nara, western Japan. The report also revealed that Abe could have been saved by bodyguards in the 2.5 seconds between a first missed shot and the fatal shots that followed. Although the top officer has officially handed in his resignation, the date of his departure is unknown. 21-time tennis Grand Slam champion Novak Djokovic has withdrawn from the U.S. Open. The tennis star officially withdrew from the tournament on Thursday as COVID-19 vaccination rules prevent him from entering the country. U.S. border policies do not allow entry by unvaccinated non-citizens. In a social media post, Djokovic thanked fans for their support and said he will wait for the next opportunity to compete. Djokovic is a longtime critic of vaccine mandates and has opted not to get the jab. His voluntary unvaccinated status saw him deported from Australia in January, stopping him from playing in the Australian Open. He was also unable to compete at the Miami Open or Indian Wells due to the same restrictions. News for dinosaur enthusiasts and fans of the Jurassic Park franchise. Jurassic World, the exhibition, opened its doors in London on Thursday and is already breaking records with 100,000 advance tickets sold, the most for the exhibit during its international run. Visitors can expect to find lifelike animatronic dinosaurs, including a velociraptor, a brachiosaurus, and of course, a Tyrannosaurus rex, which can even be fed. Park rangers are also present and serve as guides over the 1,800 square meter space. London is just the latest stop in the event tour, which has already made its way through Chicago, Paris, Madrid, and Seoul, amongst others. The exhibition is set to run until the end of the year. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. A pleasant morning brought a warm and sunny afternoon with highs nearing seasonal norms. In Seoul and Daegu, both topped out at about 29 degrees Celsius. Other parts of the country are also having that late summer heat. Despite the warmer temperatures in the capital region, sunnier skies are welcomed by many of us. Well, keep your sun protective items handy if you're in the capital region, East Coast and Gyeongsangdo provinces today. Sunny skies stay through the weekend, then drier and colder air moves in from the north, dragging morning temperatures down to the upper teens in Seoul. Then rain is in the forecast in the South early next week. Now, we should take out our light jackets for the mornings and evenings. It will only get breezier from now on, but don't put away your summer clothes just yet, especially those in Jeju and Daegu, where afternoon heat continues for a couple more weeks or so. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
Well, that ends this week's editions of the Daily Report. We return with more coverage from next Monday. Join us then. Have a safe weekend.